Bentham's most famous work, titled Introduction to the Principles of Morals in Legislation, appeared in 1789. And of course, he held this position of professor of morals starting in 1783. However, many of the social reforms inspired by his ideas didn't come about until after his death in 1832. Some of the examples of reforms that were inspired by utilitarianism include the Reform Act of 1832. And this allowed the middle class a more active role in legislating. Criminal laws became codified in 1833, and as a result, many of the severe penalties for minor crimes were reduced by 1837. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 sought to tackle poverty by creating a national system of poorhouses, which ideally would have provided the poor with work and tolerable living conditions. This particular experiment was a tremendous disaster, but to their credit, utilitarians recognized its failure, and they would later call for the reform of poor law institutions based upon utilitarian principles. Bureaucrats serving in elected councils replaced squires and magistrates as a result of the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835. This act created local governments whose legislators were subject to the punishment of dismissal, whereas squires and magistrates were appointed for life. The Factory Act of 1833 created professional inspectors who were empowered to inspect factories and even to issue fines for violations. The Lunacy Act recognized mental illness as a medical as opposed to moral problem, mandating all counties provide adequate asylum accommodation for pauper lunatics to separate them from the merely indigent or criminal, and made the inspection of all private asylums compulsory. The next figure we're going to look at is actually, on the timeline, the last of the three figures. He's the last of the great utilitarianism. He was born in 1838, and he passed away in 1900, and his name was Henry Sedgwick. Now, Sedgwick's father died when he was 3. Nevertheless, he led a very successful and satisfying life. He attended Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was an excellent scholar, distinguishing himself both in mathematics and classics. He was a Craven Scholar and a 33rd Wrangler, which meant he had the 33rd highest math test score, and a Senior Classic, that is the highest classic score. He also won the Chancellor's Medal. And so it's not a real surprise that he was appointed the Knightbridge Professor of Moral Philosophy at Cambridge, starting in the year 1883, a position that he kept until his death. He became known as an educational reformer, and ironically, despite his background in classics, he downplayed the classics and he introduced more modern subjects. And he opened higher education to women. His classic work in ethics is called Methods of Ethics and was published in 1874. Our final figure is the most iconic figure, and the middle figure in this tripartite of utilitarian thinkers. This is John Stuart Mill. He was born in 1806 and he died in 1873. Bentham and his father sought from his birth to train him to take Bentham's mantle as an intellectual advocate of utilitarianism and as a social and political reformer. Under his father's and Bentham's tutelage, Mill began studying Greek at the age of 3 and Latin at the age of 8. He had read widely in history as well as Greek and Latin classics, in addition to mastering significant portions of logic, mathematics, and economics by his 14th birthday. And of course, he read and was greatly inspired by Bentham's work. As Mill grew up, he became a prominent intellectual and a leader of a group of people called the Philosophical Radicals, who were behind a great deal of the positive political change of England during that period. However, in his early 20s, Mill had what he called a mental crisis, which looks like it was a severe depression that sort of robbed him of his sense of any importance in his work. So he retired a bit from public life, and during that convalescence, he began to view his role as a more positive reformer of society and decided to try and achieve his goals more through synthesis and dialogue. And it was soon after this period that he met his lifelong friend, collaborator, and wife, Harriet Taylor. Now, Harriet Taylor was married to another man, Mr. Taylor, and even though Mill and Taylor spent a great deal of time together, both in the company of Mr. Taylor and alone, Mr. Taylor didn't object to their close friendship. But it did cause a scandal in their social circles because it violated the norms of the time. And it caused the scandal not because of the way they were behaving, but because they made very few pretenses to hide their close friendship and the time they spent alone together. Harriet Taylor eventually would live apart from her husband, and she ultimately married Mill after Mr. Taylor's death. On Mill's account, Harriet Taylor wasn't merely an inspiration, but she was a significant collaborator on many of his philosophic and intellectual projects, including one of his most famous works, On Liberty. On Liberty contains most of the arguments that you'll find offered up by contemporary libertarians for their position. Some of his other important works include A System of Logic, published in 1843, Utilitarianism, which we'll talk about in just a minute, published in 1861, and The Subjection of Women, which argued that women should be treated equally. Now, the book Utilitarianism was written and largely successful as a broad theoretical articulation and defense of utilitarianism as a principle about the morality of individual actions, duties, and societal justice. And it was first published in 1861 and really rose to prominence in 1863. In the first chapter, called General Remarks, Mill argues the view that one comes to know moral principles not by some sort of rational intuition independent of experience, what philosophers call a priori, but instead we learn moral principles through experience and inductive reasoning. In Chapter 2, What Utilitarianism Is, he precisely formulates and carefully defends his version of the utilitarian principle. Chapter 3, The Ultimate Sanction of the Principle of Utility, he argues that utility doesn't merely inform our narrow actions, but also our broader conception of proper action through duty. In Chapter 4, The Proof of the Principle, he offers an inductive argument to the effect that all desires are ultimately rooted in the desire for happiness. And in Chapter 5, The Connection Between Justice and Utility, he argues that our notion of justice comes from our notion of social utility. And we'll talk about the specifics of the classic utilitarian doctrine in the next segment.